It didn't start with fireworks or dramatic music. There was no sudden glance across a crowded room or some destined moment that announced itself as the beginning of something unforgettable. It was ordinary, almost too ordinary to ever imagine it would become the memory that still keeps someone awake at night. They met in a place where people usually come and go without noticing each other. Just another day, another face, another voice blending into the noise of life. But sometimes, the heart notices before the mind understands, and that's how it began. There was a conversation that wasn't meant to matter. Just a few words exchanged out of necessity, polite and simple. Maybe it was a borrowed pen, a shared table, a question about the time, or a casual comment about the weather. Nothing that would make anyone think twice. Yet, in that small interaction, something quietly shifted, not loud enough to be recognized, but gentle enough to make the moment linger. It was the kind of beginning people forget to notice until they look back and realize that was the exact second everything changed. There was a softness in the way they spoke to each other, even before they knew each other's stories. No effort, no pretending, just a natural ease that made silence comfortable and words unforced. They didn't know each other's past or dreams or fears, but there was a strange familiarity, as if their hearts had met long before their names were spoken aloud. It wasn't love at first sight, but more like the first page of a story that didn't know yet how deeply it would be written. Days passed, and what felt accidental began to weave itself into routine. They started recognizing little things: footsteps, laughter, habits, the way one of them always looked at the sky before speaking, or how the other paused for a second before smiling. They didn't plan to care, but emotions don't wait for permission. There was no confession, no dramatic realization, just a slow building of something unspoken that lived between glances and breaths. It was calm, almost invisible from the outside, but real in the quiet spaces the world doesn't see. Others around them might not have noticed anything unusual. To everyone else, it was just two people who happened to spend time near each other, share a few words, or walk the same path. But hearts speak their own language, and theirs had already begun writing a chapter neither of them knew they were a part of. Some loves don't arrive with noise. They appear in silence and stay in the background until one day they are the only thing in focus. There was no promise, no expectation. Just small moments that felt lighter than air and heavier than memories. Maybe it was the way their eyes met without fear, or how they found comfort in the ordinary. They didn't know they were building something, and maybe that's why it felt so pure. When people don't search for meaning, they often stumble upon the kind that never truly leaves. Time kept moving, and with it came more of those subtle connections. A shared laugh over something no one else would understand. A gesture of kindness that went unspoken but not unnoticed. A silence that wasn't empty but full of unexpressed emotion. These moments didn't announce themselves as milestones, yet they stitched two lives closer without either of them trying. There were no questions about the future or labels for what was forming. They didn't imagine where it could lead because the present felt complete enough. It was the kind of beginning that doesn't warn you about the ache it might bring later, because pain hides itself inside the parts of life that feel the most beautiful at first. They didn't know that one day they would replay these early days in their minds, trying to remember the exact second when everything started to matter. Somewhere between all the unnoticed beginnings and fragile smiles, attachment quietly rooted itself. It wasn't dramatic, but it was deep. It wasn't loud, but it was undeniable. And if someone had told them that this quiet connection would one day become a story of love that ended too soon, they might have laughed or brushed it aside. Because in the beginning, nothing feels temporary. In the beginning, everything feels like it has time. There was a moment when things stopped feeling coincidental and started feeling connected, not because of any dramatic confession, but through the gentle weight of familiarity that began to settle between them. What started with simple exchanges slowly grew into something much deeper, built not on declarations but on quiet understanding. It was never forced, never rushed, just a natural unfolding of two hearts learning each other without realizing they were doing it. They didn't sit down and decide to care. It happened in the small pauses, the shared silences, the way conversations stretched a little longer each time without either of them wanting to walk away. Their bond developed in fragments that didn't seem significant individually but formed something solid when pieced together. It might have been the way one of them remembered tiny details the other barely noticed saying, or how their laughter blended so naturally that it felt like it had always existed between them. They started to look for each other without admitting it, glancing around rooms or checking their phones not out of habit, but out of a longing they didn't yet have the courage to name. Emotions rarely announce themselves. They grow quietly in the background, blooming in spaces where words haven't yet caught up. There were late-night talks that stretched into the early hours of the morning, not because they had important things to say, but because being heard by the right person makes even the simplest conversation feel necessary. They shared stories about their pasts, some painful, some light-hearted, and listened in ways that made each memory feel safe. There was no judgment, only acceptance, and that kind of acceptance has a way of binding hearts gently but powerfully. They began to speak about little fears and unspoken hopes, and without realizing it, they started holding pieces of each other's lives as if they were their own. Silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was peaceful, like the kind of quiet that exists between two people who don't need to fill space with noise to prove connection. A pause in their conversation didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a breath shared between emotions that didn't require explanation. Sometimes they would sit without speaking, and in those moments, something deeper than language wrote itself into their hearts. They might not have touched or confessed anything aloud, and yet there was a closeness stronger than many spoken promises. Little acts of care appeared without announcement. One of them would notice when the other was tired before they said anything. A kind word would arrive exactly when it was needed, or a small gesture would quietly replace what was missing. They began to understand each other's moods through tone alone, recognizing sadness wrapped in a smile or worry hidden behind laughter. When one of them spoke, the other listened not just with ears, but with full attention, as if each sentence held meaning worth remembering. A bond built this way doesn't ask for evidence. It simply exists, gently rooted in the spaces words don't reach. The world around them didn't change, but the way they moved through it did. They started to find comfort in knowing that someone out there saw them, not just their face or voice, but their thoughts, their pain, their joy. They could sense each other's presence even in a crowded space, and that awareness created a kind of warmth that didn't need to be spoken about. A glance across a room could feel like an embrace, and a short message during the day could carry more relief than hours of conversation with anyone else. They didn't call it love because it felt different from the stories people tell. It wasn't loud or possessive or demanding. It was soft but strong, gentle but undeniable. There was no rush to define it, because whatever it was felt secure in its quietness. It grew through shared memories, walks, inside jokes, the way they sometimes forgot the world while talking about nothing. In those simple moments, their souls began to lean toward each other, drawn by something neither of them tried to resist. They found themselves thinking about each other in unexpected moments. A song, a scent, a random detail would trigger a memory or a smile meant for the other person. Even when apart, they were not entirely separate. The connection followed them like a shadow, silent, constant, and impossible to ignore once noticed. They may not have said anything out loud, but their hearts had already begun speaking a language only the two of them understood. It didn't happen in a single moment that could be pointed at and labeled as the beginning of the change. There was no fight, no confession left hanging in the air, no visible break in the rhythm they had unknowingly built together. Instead, it came quietly, like a shift in the weather, subtle, unannounced, and only noticeable once it had already settled in. The warmth that once flowed so naturally between them began to cool, not in a dramatic way, but in the silence of pauses that felt slightly longer than before. Conversations that used to stretch endlessly started shrinking. Where there had once been effortless exchange, there were now hesitations, words chosen with more caution, and replies that arrived a little too late to feel natural. The comfort of silence didn't disappear immediately, but it began to feel different, less like peace and more like distance wrapped in quiet. They still talked, they still smiled, they still remembered things about each other, but something beneath the surface shifted, like a thread slowly loosening from a tightly woven fabric. There were moments when one of them would start typing a message, then erase it before sending. Times when something funny or meaningful happened, and the instinct to share it flickered but didn't fully ignite. Not because the connection was gone, but because uncertainty had begun to blur the confidence that once lived there. The familiarity was still present, yet it felt as though a thin layer of fog had settled over it, making everything slightly harder to reach. Nothing was wrong, yet nothing felt entirely right in the way it used to. Their eyes still searched for each other in a room, but not with the same eagerness. There was a softness replaced by a cautious kind of observation, as if both were trying to read something that hadn't been spoken aloud. They still laughed together, but the laughter didn't linger the way it once did. The echoes faded quicker, leaving behind an emptiness neither of them mentioned. Even shared memories began to feel fragile, as though speaking of them too openly might cause them to crack. Little signs began appearing, not loud enough to alarm them at first. One of them might forget to ask about the other's day, or remember, but choose not to because the timing didn't feel right anymore. A message that once would have sparked a warm response might now receive a brief acknowledgement, polite but distant. Plans that once felt natural to make started feeling uncertain, not because of a lack of desire, but because the quiet had started asking questions neither of them dared to answer. There was a change in their instincts. Moments that once drew them closer now passed without notice. Where one would have reached out, now there was hesitation. Where understanding once came easily, there was a quiet confusion neither spoke of. They didn't stop caring, but caring began to feel complicated, tangled in overthinking and unspoken fear. The connection that once rested gently between them seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for something neither of them could name. Even their memories of each other began to feel different. Instead of bringing comfort, they carried a trace of heaviness, like a reminder of something slowly slipping away. They still thought about each other, but the thoughts came with questions. Was everything still the same? Did the other person still feel it? Was something lost already, or was it just a passing phase? These questions didn't demand answers. They lingered quietly, settling into the spaces where certainty used to live. They noticed the distance, but pretended not to. Maybe both hoped it would pass on its own, or maybe neither wanted to risk breaking what was left by asking what had changed. So they carried on as though nothing was different, speaking when they could, sharing a little, holding back a little more. Smiles remained, but they didn't reach as deep. The familiarity stayed, but it no longer wrapped them in the same safety. Everything looked almost the same on the outside, and that was the strangest part of all, how something could begin to fade without disappearing, how love could still be present even as it slowly stepped back into the shadows. It didn't arrive with warning or explanation. One day, everything still looked familiar, and the next, there was a gap no one knew how to fill. There was no final argument, no confession left misunderstood, no moment loud enough to mark the exact point where everything fell apart. The separation didn't shout, it whispered, and by the time it was heard, it had already done its quiet damage. What once felt certain began to dissolve into silence that no one addressed. The distance that had slowly formed in the background finally made itself known, not in what was said, but in everything that wasn't. Messages that used to come without thinking now arrived late, or not at all. Conversations that once flowed naturally felt interrupted by pauses that neither of them tried to fix. Where there had once been eagerness, there was now hesitation, an unspoken fear of reaching out and being met with indifference. Replies shrank, greetings lost their warmth, and the timing between words stretched farther than either wanted to admit. They still cared, but caring no longer found its way into action. Something gentle and unbreakable had begun to come undone in silence. There was a day when one of them waited for a message that never came. Not an apology, not a confession, just a word, a sign, a reminder that the bond still existed. But the notification stayed absent, and instead of asking why, they convinced themselves not to expect it. Maybe they thought giving space would fix things. Maybe they were afraid the truth would hurt more than the silence. Or maybe they already knew that something had ended, and pretending otherwise felt easier than facing it. The heart often understands the goodbye long before the mind accepts it. The routine they shared without naming began to disappear. There were no more late-night talks, no casual check-ins, no small moments that used to stitch their days together. The laughter that once came effortlessly no longer echoed between them. They began to move through their days as if the connection had been a passing season rather than something that once held so much meaning. The absence wasn't loud, but it was heavy enough to feel in every hour that passed without a word. When they did speak, it felt different. Polite. Careful. As if both were walking on ground that used to be solid, but now threatened to crumble beneath any wrong step. The ease was gone, replaced by a kind of emotional distance neither of them named. They asked fewer questions, shared fewer details, and pretended the small talk was enough when both knew it wasn't. Even the smiles they offered each other felt rehearsed, like memories of what used to be rather than reflections of what was still there. There were questions unasked, thoughts buried beneath pride or fear or resignation. One might have wondered if they should reach out first, but something held them back, a belief that the other person no longer felt the same, or a fear of seeming desperate for something that might already be gone. The other may have felt the same confusion, searching for a sign that never came, hoping without admitting it that the silence would break on its own. Neither of them knew whether to hold on or let go, so the slow drift did the deciding for them. The separation wasn't just physical or conversational, it was emotional. The connection that once felt like a safe place slowly became unfamiliar territory. They stopped sharing their thoughts, their worries, their ordinary moments. They stopped being the first person each other turned to. The bond that had quietly rooted itself was now quietly loosening, not with anger, but with the kind of acceptance that hurts more because it has no clear reason. There was no closure, no discussion, no choice spoken aloud. Just a gradual retreat into distance that neither of them stopped. People around them might not have noticed anything at all. There was no dramatic fallout, no visible ending to gossip about. From the outside, it looked like two people who simply got busy or drifted apart naturally. But inside, there was a quiet ache where something once lived, a hollow space shaped like words never said and feelings never properly held. The love that had grown without warning now stepped away in the same manner, without explanation, without permission, without a final moment to mark its exit. It's strange how questions can stay alive even after the people who caused them have gone quiet. When something ends without warning, the mind doesn't accept it the way the heart is forced to. Instead, it begins to rewind every memory, every conversation, every silence, trying to locate the moment where everything started to change. It searches for reasons the other person never gave, explanations that were never spoken, signs that were missed along the way. There is no closure, only a loop of thoughts that start with what if and why not and where did it go wrong without ever landing on an answer. There are nights when the weight of uncertainty feels heavier than any truth could have. The heart tries to understand how something so real could fade without a word. It wonders if it was something said, something unsaid, or something neither of them knew how to express. Every laugh they shared, every silence they once found comfort in, becomes part of an investigation with no conclusion. The questions don't shout, they whisper over and over until even the smallest memory becomes a riddle. Maybe one of them replays old messages, not to find proof of love, but to search for the moment where warmth turned into distance. A sentence that once sounded ordinary might now feel like a clue, and a pause in a reply that went unnoticed, then now seems like a warning they failed to see. It becomes a habit, scanning the past with a magnifying mind, hoping that somewhere in those familiar moments lies the answer to a goodbye that never came with words. There's also the question of blame. Was it their fault for feeling too much, or the other person's fault for not saying enough? Did they hold on too hard, or not hard enough? Did the love disappear suddenly, or was it slowly dying while they were still believing in it? These thoughts don't arrive all at once. They come in fragments, appearing in quiet moments, in sudden pauses of the day, in dreams that feel too vivid to ignore. Even the good memories become complicated. Happiness is no longer just happiness. It becomes evidence of something that once was, making the loss sharper. The smile that felt pure back then now carries a shadow. Songs they once shared turn into reminders. Certain places feel different, even from a distance, simply because the mind has marked them with someone who is no longer there. The heart doesn't know how to separate memory from longing, so it holds both, hoping one will eventually make sense of the other. Then there's the questioning of the other person's silence. Did they walk away because they stopped caring, or because they didn't know how to stay? Did they think ending things quietly would hurt less, or did they believe the connection meant less to the other side? Maybe they thought the distance was mutual. Maybe they were scared. Maybe they were already gone long before the silence became obvious. None of these thoughts offer peace, but the mind cycles through them anyway, trying to choose the least painful possibility. There are moments when the heart tries to justify what happened. It tells itself that maybe it was temporary, that maybe the other person will return when life becomes less complicated. Then there are moments when that hope feels foolish, and the mind insists that if they wanted to stay, they would have. The push and pull between hope and reality becomes its own kind of ache, an ache built not from truth, but from the absence of it. Sometimes, the biggest questions don't even come from doubt, but from love itself. Did they ever feel the same depth? Were the unspoken emotions one-sided? Were they holding on to something the other person only saw as temporary? If the love was real, why wasn't it enough to fight for? And if it wasn't, why did it feel so honest while it lasted? These aren't questions that ask for answers out loud. They live in the quiet, where only the soul can hear them. Even time struggles to silence these thoughts. Days may pass, then weeks, but the mind still returns to the empty spaces where replies should have been, to the promises that were never made, but always felt, to the version of the story that never got told. The love didn't end with understanding. It ended with silence, and silence is a cruel companion to memory. It leaves behind conversations that never happened, truths that were never spoken, and 1,000 questions that echo long after the person is gone. Acceptance doesn't always arrive as a moment of clarity. Sometimes it comes slowly, not as peace, but as exhaustion, the kind that settles in after fighting questions with no answers for too long. At first, the heart resists. It holds on to memories like they are proof of something still alive, replaying every detail as if the past might change if remembered hard enough. But over time, the silence speaks louder than any goodbye could have. The absence becomes familiar, and even though it hurts, it starts to feel less like a wound and more like a part of the skin. There are mornings when the weight on the chest feels lighter, not because the pain is gone, but because the heart is too tired to carry it the same way. The thoughts still come, but they don't pull as sharply. The memories still surface, but they no longer demand explanations. The love doesn't vanish, but it steps back, making room for reality to settle in. Acceptance isn't agreement with what happened. It's simply the quiet understanding that nothing will change by wishing it could have ended differently. They start noticing the silence less. Where once every unsent message felt unbearable, now it just feels expected. The instinct to reach out fades gradually, replaced not by indifference, but by the understanding that some feelings are meant to be kept quietly rather than shared. There is no dramatic moment of letting go, just small realizations layered over time. Realizations like knowing they no longer check their phone at the same hour, or that certain songs don't break them the way they used to, or that their mind doesn't immediately drift to the same name when something beautiful or painful happens. The world around them keeps moving, even on days when their heart feels stuck in place. Life doesn't pause for heartbreak, and slowly, almost unwillingly, they begin to move with it. They laugh at things again, even if the laughter still carries a shadow. They make new routines, even if the old ones still echo quietly in memory. Healing doesn't erase what was felt, it simply teaches the heart how to carry it more gently. There is still love, still longing, but it learns to exist without expectation. Sometimes acceptance feels unfair. It feels like giving up on something that once meant everything. But in truth, it is not surrender, it is survival. It is choosing to stop reopening the same wound by searching for reasons in a story that ended without giving one. It is understanding that closure doesn't always come from the person who left. Sometimes it has to be created in silence, built from the pieces of a heart that refuses to stay broken forever. There are days when the love feels close again, like it could return if only the right moment appeared. But those days don't last like they used to. The heart still aches, but it doesn't chase. It remembers, but it doesn't beg the memory to change. It still wonders sometimes if things could have gone differently, if the other person ever thinks about what was left behind, but these thoughts don't hold the same power. They come and go like passing weather rather than storms that tear everything apart. Acceptance also brings a quiet truth. Love that ended too soon doesn't stop being love. It doesn't become meaningless just because it didn't last. It stays in small places, the way a certain word reminds them of a laugh once shared, or how they still pause when they hear a similar voice, or the way their eyes soften at the thought of what once was. The love remains, but the desperation to hold on to it begins to fade. It becomes something softer, something that doesn't demand to be returned. There may never be a day when the memory disappears completely. Some people leave, but their presence lingers in the heart long after their footsteps fade. Acceptance doesn't erase that presence, it shapes it into something bearable. Something that doesn't break the soul each time it is remembered. The heart learns that missing someone is not a weakness, and moving forward is not betrayal. The love can stay quietly without needing to be revived. And so, without announcing it, without even fully noticing the moment it happens, they begin to live alongside the loss instead of inside it. The ache doesn't control every thought. The silence no longer feels like an unanswered question. The ending, though painful, becomes a part of their story rather than the whole of it. The heart still remembers what was lost, but it also starts to make space for what has yet to come.